I had my go live now tweet ready to go.
So unprofessional.
I know. Live now, PHP for Beginners. Join us. Smiley face. You always got to lead. Always got to end stuff with smiley faces. That's the key to communication online. Because you can't get that emotion unless you add an emoticon. They have
Start
no
things off
idea.
right. Yeah.
I mean, you could be saying, join us. Or you could be saying, join us. You'd be like, join us! You know, like, there's so many ways to interpret that. But if you add a smiley face, it's like, join us. Speaking of joining us, thanks for joining us. I'm Sammy K. Powers, and this is the PHP Roundtable. This is the live podcast of developers discussing PHP things or topics that PHP nerds care about. The ultimate goal of this podcast is to learn a little something from each other, and hopefully we'll learn something today. If you want to be a part of this little broadcast, send a tweet to PHP Roundtable on Twitter. I'll be sitting here monitoring it, and if you happen to pop up on my screen, I'll definitely try to mention you in the live recording. So this is the golden episode, episode 50. Today we're discussing the thing that this podcast is all about. It's all about PHP, and we're going to try to bring it back to the basics this time. For those who are just dabbling around in PHP or have considered learning it, this episode is for you. In this episode, we discuss the first steps that you'll need to take in order to transfer yourself from layman to PHP programmer. And now that we know what we're talking about, let's meet the panel. Mr. Andy Huggins is the first guy I'm going to mention here in no particular order. Been doing PHP for 8 years and thinks PHP is great. He also dabbles in open source. Welcome, Andy.
Hi.
We also, I've mentioned you several times on this podcast because you are the guy who made the show notes repo initially and was like, hey, we should get the show notes open source. And I was like, that's a great idea. So thanks for doing that. Also, we have Nick Escobedo. He's the co-organizer of the PHP User Group in Chicago. And me too. Hey, buddy, high five. And soon to be married. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. All right, so we're talking about PHP and how beginners can get started with it. And I wanted to, Andy, you were the one who was asking me beforehand. Is like, are we talking about PHP for beginners, as in they've never programmed before and they're learning on PHP, or are we talking about people who are programming for other languages and want to learn PHP? And I was thinking we could kind of gear it more towards the people who are learning programming for the first time in PHP, but I would like to kind of at least comment kind of halfway through about people who are coming from client-side languages who might not be familiar with web-based languages, because there's a pretty big difference. And we're going to get into that. But first, I do want to give a shout-out to Rinel Haki. I'm probably saying that wrong. I'm sorry, buddy. But he filled out the be a guest form on PHP Roundtable, and he was saying that, hey, I want to do this this topic about starting with PHP. I want to talk about the echo keyword. And we tried to get him on the episode, but it didn't work out, unfortunately. But hopefully we'll get you on in a future episode. So thanks, Minral. I don't know how to say your name. I'm sorry. But thanks for this idea, and hopefully this will be really helpful for people who are kind of checking this out for the first time. So let's talk about like maybe teaching yourself, right? So did you guys learn a PHP like officially in a school or something, or did you actually just teach yourself PHP?
Taught myself. Like
how?
Way, pretty much. Books, resources, Google, the internet, you know.
So for me, I was kind of frustrated with Java, so I started out in Java at the university, and I just felt like there was an easier way to do things, web-based things, and so I just transitioned to doing PHP. We had a capstone project that we had to do for a client, and instead of doing it in Java, I decided to do it in PHP.
Cool. And what was that experience like, this transition?
It felt liberating in a way, because I mean, to do some certain things in Java there was a lot more to doing things in Java than to do certain things in PHP. When you're talking about doing things on the web, it just seemed there's a lot of unnecessary things that you had to do with Java, so transition to PHP.
So you're saying you started out Java programming first? Because I actually started out, I think, basically on PHP.
I started Java first.
That's
what
cool.
about you, Sam?
I started with QBasic originally, and was very fond of the go-to keyword, which we can talk about later. But I've actually used go-tos in production several times in the past couple weeks, and I'm actually very proud of it. But yeah, so I started in QBasic, and then my buddy David Potter, who I grew up with, was like, dude, you got to learn HTML and all this stuff. It's like the next thing, the next big thing. It's going to be bigger than QBasic. And I was like, oh, really? And then we started getting into making like Duke Nukem 3D level websites, and we were sharing our Duke Nukem 3D levels with each other on our websites that we made. And then we started getting into more dynamic stuff with PHP. And yeah, we're still stuck in PHP for some reason. But I do dabble in a bunch of other languages, but mainly PHP all day. That's what I get paid for. So, so let's you mentioned, Andy, that you Googled and you read some books and stuff. One of the key components probably to teach yourself programming is probably being an expert Googler, right?
Yeah, I'd say so. Like that's one of the things I think is the hardest part about like getting better is when you don't know what something is, you don't know how to Google it. So like you can't find it. So like
right.
I think that's where reading books and talking to people comes in. So like I think for me personally, I think one of the best things you can do is find like a mentor or some other programmers like at a PHP user group or something like that. And once you start talking to people, you actually can like learn so much faster just by having conversations about stuff.
Yeah, to kind of piggyback off that, one of the things that I found the easiest to figure out what I needed to do when I was searching through Google was to break the problem into the smallest chunk possible. So if we're trying to build a calculator, look up how do I add two numbers in PHP or whatever language, and then just kind of go from there, because you might be able to find a full-fledged calculator app, but if you're trying to do something, let's say adding or subtracting, multiplying, then you would look up those specifically.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a really great idea to kind of break down, thinking about problems and kind of like breaking them down to smaller components, because that's ultimately what we're going to have to do in programming.
Right.
And I think you made a really good point about when you're Googling, when you don't know what to Google, like you want to do something, but you're like, what is this even called? A great way, like you said, Andy, is that you get involved in the community, and then you'll start learning some of these words, some of these keywords that you can Google later. And especially if you're listening to this episode, hopefully we'll be able to sort of like say, okay, this is a keyword you can look up on Google. So hopefully by the end of this episode, you won't be like, oh, I feel like I can program in PHP, but at least you'll be like, oh, I know how to even start. You know, I can actually get on Google and search for what I need to do. So really, Google really did teach me how to program. Not Google itself, but being able to search on Google. But it's funny that like I kind of take that for granted, the ability to search online on Google to find the solution that I'm looking for. Like I forgot how hard it was back in the day to like find what I was looking for, because I didn't know what anything was called, and I was like looking up and I couldn't find anything. But it is it's quite an impressive skill to have if you're able to Google yourself to knowledge.
I agree. And I find that actually translates into other things as well outside of programming. You know, so I feel like sometimes I'm able to find things that other people aren't. I can't.
Yeah, definitely. It's like that's what people call like the Google foo, right? Like the ability just to find something that seems completely unrelated and put it together and be like, yeah, this was it. Why didn't you find this?
Absolutely, that's kind of funny. It's like when my dance partner Heather, she'll like ask a question. I'm like, why don't you just Google it? Like, just it's right there. But like for her, that's just not in her mind to just like go and just look for the answer. It's like it's just I've just done it my whole life, so I take it for granted. So yes, so starting with Google and really starting with community. I like where you're going with that, Andrew, or Andy or Andrew. Andrew, I'm going to call you Andrew Andy. Well, because you're showing up I know you're Andy, but you're showing up as Andrew on my screen. So like when I look on it, I'm like, oh, Andrew. So I like what you were talking about with the user groups and kind of getting involved with that. So like how does someone get involved in a user group? Like where do you even start? And what is a user group?
It's a bunch of nerds getting together talking about nerd things. No, I mean the user groups are awesome. It's where you can meet other people that also use the language you use. Generally, like I think locally there's like a PHP, a JavaScript, WordPress, Laravel. All those user groups are available, so you can kind of find generally what you want. I think there might even be a Ruby or Rails one or something like that. So it's like if you're interested in learning one of those things, go there and talk to people. like just show up. Usually it's like on Meetup or somewhere else, and you can find them when they meet and just show up. That's all it is.
Yeah, and I can speak to the PHP ones specifically. I know that we purposely try to engage new people, even if you haven't programmed at all and you're just interested in learning more about PHP or whatever it is about PHP. We're very open to new people. So especially if you're trying to learn something new, definitely check out a PHP user group.
Yeah, it's a great way too to like just like get all these keywords thrown in your head where you're like all this stuff might be going over your head, but at least like some of those are going to be coming at you like over and over, and that redundancy will make some of those stick out more than others, and you're like, oh wait, I keep hearing about this thing, I should Google it and figure out what's about this, what's all about this thing. So yeah, definitely reach out to your local user group. Getting connected to a community early is a great way to onboard yourself to a new programming language like PHP.
Yeah, like when I started out, like I was at a company and I was basically the only programmer in my department, or almost the whole company. So it was really hard for me to learn. And then when I left that job and went to my first like development firm job, I was surrounded by other developers. Like that's when I started to learn a lot. So that's why I say that as well.
Yeah, and even if people don't know the answer to the questions, at least they can probably point people in the right direction.
Yeah,
absolutely. And you might even find somebody to do, and here's a keyword for you, pair programming. It's a great little thing where you can like sit there and program and somebody just sits over your shoulder and watches you program, or the other person can sit there and program. You can watch them and you can ask them questions while they're doing things, and it's a really great way to learn. So pair programming, the keyword to look up on Google. But this is the PHP Roundtable, so we're talking about PHP specifically, so it makes sense that, we're talking about, if you're learning to program, here's how you would do it with PHP. But why PHP? Like, there's all these programming languages out there. PHP is very good at doing its own thing. It's famously quoted as being really good at running very bad code. So if you're afraid of writing really bad code, PHP is going to run it really well for you. But it's specifically designed from the get-go to be a web-based language. So if you're wanting to make websites and you need something to do something a little bit more dynamically in what's called the back end, PHP is a great option for that. But there's lots of other options. There's Ruby, there's Perl, there's Python. There's lots of different options out there. But why would you guys recommend people choose PHP?
The barrier to entry, so the ease of use, just to get in and, let's say, print something on the screen or to do basic things, in my opinion, is low. And there are a lot of resources out there for new people to get going and to get things started.
Yeah, I would echo, or I would piggyback off that as well. It is, I think, the ability to jump in is pretty good. Like I would say maybe JavaScript might be the only thing that's probably a little bit easier since you don't need a server, right? But PHP, once you get like understanding of how the server, like what you need to run a server, that's pretty easy, I'd say.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy how available PHP is, especially like if you have a MacBook, you can just open up Terminal, which is that little black box. That's what Heather calls it. She's like, hey, can you open that black box again? Yes, the terminal. So it's called the terminal. So if you click on the terminal, you might have to find it under applications that's like hidden in there somewhere, or use Spotlight to type in terminal. And if you type in the terminal, you'll get this prompt, and it just sits there and it waits for your command. So if you type in PHP space -v and then you press enter, it should show you the version of PHP that your Mac just came with out of the box. So it's kind of cool that you can just run it on, like, there's so many devices that have PHP. There's like random routers that have PHP installed on them for whatever reason, which it's got pros and cons, because typically old insecure versions of PHP are running on some old devices which could be exploited, and that's kind of like another entire topic altogether. But you guys already mentioned that that it's easy to kind of get started with, and it's very available. And something that I didn't actually think about until Anthony Ferrara, who's one of the internal contributors to PHP, was giving a keynote, and he was talking about how the standard library for PHP is very extensive. And if you're new to this kind of terminology, the standard library for a language is basically all of the things, the tools that you get out of the box without even having to code anything. So if you're thinking of it in terms of cooking, it's like those pre-made ingredients for you. You don't have to start with the raw flour or whatever. You just get like this cookie dough that's already there, and you just put it in the oven, kind of thing. So with PHP, we have the standard library that I grew up with. I grew up with PHP, so I never realized how awesome the standard library was, because it does everything, not everything, but it does a lot of things for you. And a lot of other languages don't have that. And in fact, some very basic functionality that we've grown up with, it's kind of funny to see other languages like JavaScript have kind of drama associated with their lacking of standard library when they're using this. Now this is kind of getting a little off topic here, and for beginners is kind of ridiculous, but just put a bookmark on this for a second. But for those who are listening who are a little bit more experienced with PHP and understand the package management thing, JavaScript had this problem a little while ago where there's a package that was designed just to pad a string in one direction. And so another keyword there, looking up string or string literal in programming, something to look up if you're new to this programming stuff. And when that package went down, like all these problems started happening. And the reasons why these problems were happening is because JavaScript doesn't have this immense standard library like PHP. PHP is very easy to pad strings left or right or whichever way, in the middle, whatever you want to do. Actually, is there like in the middle? I don't think there's a string pad middle, is there? There's a constant string pad. I don't have to look it up. Somebody's gonna write it. Somebody's gonna yell at me. Oh, one other thing is PHP runs 82% of the world's websites, according to w3text.com. Which is kind of crazy. So there's a lot of demand there for it. Like lots of jobs out there for PHP programmers. So lots of good reasons to do PHP. But do you guys have any reasons why maybe we shouldn't do PHP? Why would we not choose PHP? Just to play devil's advocate here. Or is PHP just the greatest?
I mean, for me, if I'm doing something web related, I guess, I mean, I'm speaking from, I guess, hearsay, but I feel like there are other programming languages that can do real heavy computational things better than PHP. So if you're maybe doing lots of data crunching and stuff like that, maybe PHP isn't necessarily the best. But the only other time that I think that I wouldn't use it personally would be if I'm just building on a separate platform that doesn't have PHP. So, for example, if I'm doing something with Android, you don't have another option. Right. My first pick would be to use PHP if it's something web related, though. I'm biased.
For me, that's pretty much all I've really worked in, so I don't really have like a great perspective of other instances of using programming languages. So, yeah.
No, it's interesting that I like, Nick, you brought up the idea that the context is really important, and that's really important in programming in general. Especially when you're starting off and you're learning something new, context is so key. And I think as developers, we're always constantly looking at like, what's the best idea or best way to do this, or what's the best solution to do this, and really it depends. Like the answer to any really good question is it depends, right? So if there's not a clear answer, sometimes it just depends on your context, and maybe there isn't like a clear-cut answer all the time. So be prepared for that, I guess, as a new onboarding person to PHP. And by the way, if you're new to PHP, you should know it does have a little bit of a bad reputation, mainly because of the way that it kind of grew up inside of the web world, and it used to kind of be the People think of PHP as sort of like the script kiddie thing, and the script kiddie is another keyword. It's kind of like a developer thing, basically cutting and pasting code to figure out how things work, and that's great. That's where you should be. Like if you want to just figure out how something works, just copy paste, try to break things. That's how you learn. So, but it does have kind of a bad reputation. It's getting more and more people are starting to realize that hey, this is legit, and there's no reason to be being so mean to PHP developers. Not that they're mean to PHP developers, but I do get scoffed at when I say I do PHP. We're actually having an entire episode on this, by the way, of why I'm afraid to admit that I program in PHP with other developers. So if you're interested in learning more about why that's kind of a thing, there's going to be an episode about that. Can you guys think of anything else why people might not want to do PHP, or might? Have you guys ever encountered any reasons why people say they don't do PHP or they don't like it?
So you're talking about PHP specifically? Because I know, there's some companies that prefer not to. Whether they're used to running certain stacks, and so you got to use what they use.
Yeah. I don't know. I think from the perspective of a beginner, though, like I think PHP is a great thing to start with. Like, I don't think Java or C++ or something would be more complicated, or makes it more difficult to learn. Whereas PHP is a little bit, like he said originally, it's more approachable.
True that. And there are so many resources online. Actually, while we're sitting here even talking about resources and stuff, Jeffrey Way from Laracast, who's actually one of the official sponsors of PHP Roundtable, Laracast sponsors the developer shout out, and we're going to get to that towards the end. But he just tweeted that there's this great series, little shameless plug here, on laracast.com/series/PHP for Beginners. It's PHP-for-beginners. And it's got all the steps here: getting PHP installed, figuring out like what your editor is, what variables are, PHP and HTML's relationship, all that kind of stuff. So if you want a starting point, hey, there's a good starting point right there. Or if you just Google PHP tutorial or intro to PHP, those are some good keywords to look up, and you'll get all kinds of great resources there. So thanks, Jeffrey, for chiming in on that. One other thing that people have said about PHP that they don't like is the syntax is ugly compared to, like, say, Ruby. So syntax basically meaning like how you write it, like how your code actually looks. And whatever, to each his own. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, so whatever. I agree it's not as pretty as Ruby, but it doesn't really bother me so much that there's so many semicolons. In PHP, every line is ended with a semicolon for the most part. Not every single line, but most lines are ended with semicolon. And I would say the biggest thing against PHP that I actually kind of agree with, but it doesn't bother me because I've been growing up with it so long, is that the standard library, we already talked about the standard library as those kind of like those ingredients that you get baked into the language. The standard library is very inconsistent. Finding inconsistencies in the PHP standard library is like finding a haystack in a needle, in fact. Anybody? Rim shot.
Nice.
So if you don't know why that joke is funny, or really not funny, it's just kind of a play on words there. The standard library is very inconsistent as far as what's the API, and the API stands for Application Programming Interface, I believe. Yes, it specifies how software components should interact. And so when you're designing things in your programming, in your code, you basically can figure out like, oh, how do I want to interact with this feature and things like that. And when PHP was being developed, it was just being developed by people all around the world, just random, like all these random contributions were being added to it at once. And when that happens, there's not like this one cohesive idea of like, oh, all of these APIs should interact kind of like consistently across the board. And we ended up getting like APIs that were just like all over the place. So it's not as big of a deal because the PHP documentation is amazing. So if you're kind of worried about like where to even start, actually going to php.net, there's a great place to start because that's the official website of PHP, and there's tons of great documentations on that. So,
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's I see why people say that, how there's many inconsistencies. Again, for me personally, it's a non-issue because I'm always using the php.net as a resource and Google as a resource that eventually you just remember many of them, and where you don't remember them, you can either use Google or maybe your IDE, your development environment fills that in for you. So, I mean, I see why people, but I just feel like that's really not that big of a deal.
Yeah, you mentioned the IDE, which is a really interesting thing that you can Google too. The Integrated Developer Environment, is that right? Or Development Environment, I should say. Yeah, so this is a very helpful tool that you can install. It's something you run on your computer, and it basically knows the language that you're coding in and can give you helpful hints as you're starting to type. It can like start to autocomplete things like you would autocorrect or autocomplete on your phone. But it actually does it with the code. That's if you are just starting out, that's not 100% necessary. That's if you're like really starting to get more involved. But there's lots of really cool IDEs out there. Like, can you guys name a couple off the top of your head?
PHP Storm's my go-to.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, that's pretty much the only one that I know of for PHP.
I used to do Aptana and NetBeans.
Yeah.
I used
Um,
to use Dreamweaver back in the day.
oh yeah,
Is that,
Dreamweaver.
is that an
I mean,
IDE though?
I don't know. It's interesting development environment.
Yeah, true.
Absolutely. Well, so I wanted to touch on something that came up not too long ago when I was talking to one of my brilliant programmer friends. He's actually a client-side programmer. He works, and by the way, I should clarify, when we talk about web-based languages, we're talking about languages that are primarily used on the web, making websites work behind the scenes. When we're talking about client-side things, we're talking about things that run on your computer, like your browser is a client-side. That's kind of like a ambiguous example a little bit, but any FTP. Well, shoot, all my programs are web-related. Photoshop is a good example of a client-side program, and so is like your OS, your operating system is a client-side program. So all these things, the kind of distinguish. This is kind of like a very 3,000 foot view or 30,000 foot view of client-side versus web-based. It gets a lot more nuanced than this, but when I was talking with my friend who works with client-side stuff, he works with like low-level stuff. And we're talking low-level, we're talking about like messing with the memory of the computer and like directly communicating with the memory of like this. I don't even know the keywords. I'm just really bad at messing with low-level stuff. I've done a little bit, but not a lot. And I really respected him as a programmer. I do respect him as a programmer. And we were just sitting there talking. He's like, "Hey, I want to do this thing. I'm thinking about doing it in PHP, but I don't understand like how HTTP works." And like, it just kind of blew me away. I was like, "Wait, how do you not know how HTTP works? It's like the foundation of the internet." And then I realized that as a web developer, that's like something. That's one of the foundations that you kind of have to know really well. But other programmers who maybe just work with, low-level memory or hardware stuff may have never really ever encountered it. So have you guys really, in your programming experience, how much time do you end up spending like on stuff that's related to HTTP or understanding the HTTP protocol or anything like that?
So for me, it's going to be a lot of Ajax stuff, and I don't know if you want to go ahead and explain Ajax or now or
Go
later.
ahead.
I mean, Ajax is it's a way for us to communicate with the server without refreshing the page. So if we write some, in your terminology, client-side, right?
Yeah.
If we write some client-side scripts, let's say in JavaScript, and we want to ping the server for information without having to refresh the page, we can ping the server with some data, and the server will return us some data. I don't remember what my point was now after that.
This is like how you do PHP or HTTP stuff in your daily programming stuff.
Right. Because when we get the data back from the server, we want to know that, hey, everything happened okay, or no, everything didn't happen okay. And so there's standards that are defined by HTTP that respond with status codes. And in general, we're looking for a 200 that says, hey, the server responded okay.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And it's kind of important to kind of know how the protocol at least works at least at a higher level. So if you want to Google HTTP protocol and kind of get a good broad idea of what that is and how it works, that will be really helpful for you when you're starting with a web-based programming language like PHP. And so I used to actually think that client-side programming was actually harder or had like a higher learning curve than web-based languages until I started talking with this guy who was working with client-side stuff. And so they have to worry about low-level stuff like memory management, like garbage collection, right? Hardware considerations, all these the compiler differences and all this stuff. And I was like, for me, that's like, oh my gosh, there's so much to learn. But for somebody who is just starting with web-based languages, think of all the stuff they have to learn too. It's like they have to learn the HTTP. We were just talking about HTTP, TCP stuff. What was this TLS/SSL stuff? Or HTTPS, right? What's DNS? What's IMAP/POP? What's IP, and what's the difference between IPv4 and IPv6? And like, there's so many like random acronyms that you got to learn, and like, I mean, and it's just so much to almost take in that it can be really daunting. And I feel like that can kind of like shut people down, and be like, oh, there's just too much to learn. What would you say to somebody who's just kind of feeling overwhelmed by just all the stuff that they feel like they have to learn?
Get used to it. No, I mean, like there is a lot to learn. Like that's kind of the reality of it, though. But it's not. It's okay. Like you don't have to know everything day one. So just dig into something, like whatever problem you're faced with, figure that one problem out, and then you'll know it. And then the next time you just keep doing it.
Yeah, and like he said, it's okay. Be okay with yourself with not knowing everything. Like it's okay. I think anybody that's on your team will understand. You're coming in with an understanding. Let's say you join a team. They're coming in with the understanding that you are new. Or if you're asking questions, maybe just let them know that you're new to give some context around your question. And people I think will in general respond to those types of questions in a different way than if they were talking to us and we asked how to add 2 plus 2.
Yeah, and also you should like hopefully the place you work has the idea to and like bring everybody in, so it's not like, ooh, I'm better than you because I know something that you don't know, but like instead it has the mentality of like, cool, like I can show you this new thing if you don't know what it is. So like I think there's a big difference. Like I've worked at places where it was like that, like it was like people expected you to know something, and it's like how there's no way everybody knows everything about this, so let's all just work together. Like
Yeah, and again, totally just if you can break the problem down into a smaller chunk instead of trying to think of it all at once, that for me is huge. Just being able to break things down into more manageable chunks, not something that's just it's overwhelming your brain, but just break it down to something that you can understand and then start from there.
That's all really good advice. I love that because it really is a process. Like there's just I almost feel like to get really good at programming, you almost have to enjoy the process of being in the whole like I don't know what I'm doing phase like all the time. Like I still am like that all the time when I'm programming.
Me too.
So one of the things I want to add to is like I've been thinking about this recently, and basically I think though programming is essentially the result of like good habits. So be aware that like everything you're learning could be a bad habit or it could be a good habit, and to be better you want to focus on the good habits, but you may not be aware what's good or bad initially. But just be aware like there could be alternate ways of doing something that could be better, and focus on doing good habits.
That's really good advice. I like that. And to even more to even further go with that idea is to think about like maybe even some of the things that you're doing might not necessarily be qualified as bad and not necessarily as good, but sort of like in the middle kind of gray area, and then not really understanding why you did something like that, or maybe you did it because that's the only way you know how to do it. That's cool too. Like just be okay with being in the gray area,
Right.
and being on the side of like this is probably wrong, but I'm going to put it out there anyway. So um,
Yeah, I would also add if you're unsure, just to ask somebody else that is a developer. Uh, it doesn't hurt. Maybe they can help point you in the right direction. Even if they say it's not necessarily the best way, here's how you can improve. Even if you didn't do it right the first time, well, now you understand, how you can improve from now on.
Yeah.
yeah.
And I guess like too, like you gotta practice those good habits. So like if something you feel like you keep running into the same problems, like you have to work at like breaking your habits is another thing like I always thought was interesting. So it's like if you constantly do like if checks everywhere, you might want to try to break out of that habit.
Yeah, so there's always in programming, just be aware that there's definitely going to be a lot of best practices or best way to do things, and that changes depending on what year it is. So when you're learning this stuff, make sure that you're like, okay, I'm learning this, and I am fully aware that this might change in a year. It might change in 6 months. One of the key words that you'll get really used to in programming is this word called refactoring, which is a fancy word that means rewriting the code that you already have there. And really, coding for me is just a constant process of refactoring. It's just a constant process of massaging the code that you already have and trying to start with a rough draft and then massage it down to get something more fine and stuff. Do you guys kind of come up with that idea too? Like I've been kind of nerding out on a refactoring thing recently, where I'm just kind of like, just throw out the first draft, get it working, and then refactor like crazy. Or do you guys just kind of do you guys? I don't. Different environments require different things, right? Like for a long time there, I was able to just go all done, out, done, no refactoring. Do you guys have that in your environment as well, or?
No, I mean, you can go.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Anytime I get the chance to go back and look at some code where I feel like I could have maybe improved a little bit, it's a great feeling. I love that feeling of being able to learn from my own code. Like if I look at code that I have written, let's say 2 years ago, and let's say now we need to add an extra feature to that, and I need to come back and this code needs to be refactored. It's an enlightening experience as well, because you can see the progress. Because the progress happens, maybe it seems slowly. By the time you get to looking at code that's a year old, you can see it's a very noticeable difference. And so I really enjoy actually going back and refactoring code when I can.
Yeah, the worst developer ever is me 6 months ago. That guy is horrible. Doesn't know anything.
Yeah.
But 6 months future, he's awesome. He's going to be amazing.
It is really cool to go back and look at your old code and kind of be like, who wrote this? This is awful. And they're like, oh, that was me.
Yeah, and I would say actually to keep that around.
Yeah.
Keep the old code around, even if it's not on GitHub. Keep it on your computer, and look back at it. In a few years. For me, I really like to latch on to my big wins, and by big wins I mean if I look at this code and I can see that there's a noticeable difference between what I did a few years ago and now, I latch onto that. So when I'm running through a tough problem, I latch onto that and say, well, I've come along this so far. I can continue doing this. And I guess on top of that is the same thing when you actually solve a really difficult problem that beforehand you didn't think that you could figure it out. I highly recommend just storing that in your memory and coming back to that later, because there's been so many times where I felt like quitting, and then I remember I had that same feeling where I felt like quitting and I did not quit, and then I actually solved the issue, and it was such a great feeling. So I would highly recommend storing those wins.
That's a good idea. That's great.
Yeah.
So as you're learning and you're kind of figuring out a little bit at a time, like, okay, so how does programming work? There's a great tweet that I saw not too long ago which said, coding is like writing a novel, except for if you miss just one semicolon, the entire thing doesn't make sense. And it's really true. Like, it's very finicky. Like, for people who are just used to writing just normal stories or whatever, when you get to programming, like the semicolon matters, especially in PHP. So say you're writing your first hello world script. That's what it's called. A lot of times when you're learning a new programming language, whether you're a seasoned developer or it's your first time programming, you're going to write a hello world script, which basically means you're going to try to program in the programming language of choice, and you're going to try to run that program so that it outputs hello world in some way, either in the browser, on the terminal, somewhere. Input, output, right? So this is the first script that you'll probably write. And if you start writing that PHP script and you figure out how, okay, I need the echo, okay, echo keyword, okay, then I need a quotation mark here, and then I write hello world and end my quotation mark, and I press save, and I try to load it in my web browser just like the tutorial said, and then I get like this white screen and there's nothing there, and it's like, what? I should have worked. I should see hello world. So like, what do you tell somebody when they try to run a program and all they see is a white screen? Just blow the computer out.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're in the room with them, ask to see the code.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Like having somebody review your code.
Yeah, I mean, to keep everybody on the same page, because I think that you'll find when you do start talking about things more technical, that if everybody isn't on the same page, it's gonna be real difficult time.
For sure.
I mean,
listening. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, I don't know, like in that specific example, like it's such a weird thing, because it's like, I guess you'd have to check and make sure your server is running, because otherwise that is so simple, like echo hello world how does that not work?
Right.
Like, I don't know.
Yeah, so like if the server's running is another good. Is it plugged in? That's the first one. Yeah, and so like, say if there's like a syntax error and they've got errors turned off, for example. So like there's settings in PHP
Right.
where you could have your errors turned off, and so if there is a syntax error, that's going to throw an error, and then it's not going to show anything because in production you don't want to show your errors. And by production I mean a server that's running so the whole world can see it. Whereas usually we like to develop on our own little laptops, and that might be a little bit advanced. Although I think the Laracast snippet that Jeffrey shared us. It's actually a whole screencast of starting with PHP. I think he actually gets into like developing locally. But I was listening to CPP Cast, which is a C++ podcast, and episode number 30 with Kate Gregory. I've never met Kate, but she reminds me. Just listening to her, she reminds me a lot of Elizabeth Smith from the PHP community. She's just like full of life and like very passionate about empowering new developers and things like that. And she mentioned that when she teaches C++ for the first time, she doesn't teach. And by the way, C++ is one of those lower level languages where you're messing directly with the memory and stuff like that. So it's very different than PHP. Although the syntax for C is actually quite similar to PHP. Just a little fun fact. So they were saying, she was saying in this episode that she likes to teach developers how to debug right out of the gate, and specifically step debugging. So if you're new to PHP, one of the very first things that you learn after you've written your first couple of hello world scripts, you've learned what the if statement is, what the for each statement is, what the for loops, how to do all those things. I would highly recommend learning step debugging. That's the very next step, because what step debugging does is it allows you to go watch your script get executed line by line, see what the computer's doing, see what the variables are being set, and there's a really great I think, actually, speaking of, I keep referring back to Laracast, but I think there's a great, Jeffrey has a series on Laracast about IDEs, and he has one for PHP Storm, and I'm pretty sure he goes over step debugging in that. If not, I'm sure we'll pressure him to add one. But step debugging is really great. You can look up if you Google step debugging with PHP Storm, and PHP Storm is a paid IDE, but I think you get like a free trial version or something. Or if you go to user groups, actually, here's a great idea. They give out a lot of free licenses to user groups. So if you're attending user groups and you want a free subscription to PHP Storm to play around with it, it's you might want to just check that out. You might get a free subscription, a free license. But step debugging is something you want to Google and learn. And if you want to learn more about debugging specifically in PHP, we actually have an episode about debugging in episode 34, and the title was "Debugging is More Than var dump." Var dump, you're going to get used to that one because that is a little part of the standard library that will dump out to standard output whatever variable that you want to. Speaking of variables, we haven't talked about variables. There's lots to learn, but hey, you're going to Google it and you're going to figure it out. Do you guys have any specific online resources? We already mentioned Laracast. Are there any other online resources that you guys use for teaching yourself or teaching others?
I mean, I always end up at Stack Overflow one way or another.
Yes.
So stackoverflow.com would be that website. I mean that's such a huge resource. I think for almost everybody, for all programming languages, you can find most things on there. But aside from that, Google's huge. But then I feel like there's people like us who tend to write blog posts about various quirks that they encounter, whether it's at work or they're messing around. And so aside from Stack Overflow, I feel like there's so many blogs that, not necessarily one blog in particular, but again, Google's our friend here.
Yeah, I would say like bloggers, finding individual programmers out there that write their own blogs, that's usually really good. I think Medium.com now is actually getting pretty good with a lot of things on there.
Yeah, it's gotten a lot more popular with bloggers
Or,
talking about tech stuff.
What was that? Scotch.io is pretty good too, right?
Yes.
I don't think I've used that one.
No?
You'd probably
Yeah.
recognize it if you're, yeah.
You're such a beginner, dude.
Sounds familiar. Yeah. Scotch.io. Look that up later. Cool. What about, have you guys ever hung around in the Stack Overflow Room 11 PHP room?
I haven't hung out in that room, but I've been on IRC.
Oh yeah, IRC. For people who are into that, I am not into that, so I don't know. But I hear it's great.
Yeah, there's there seems to be that there's a lot more active, or there's a lot more people at any given time on that than there is in the room 30. Every time I've checked room 30, it's only been like 20 or 30 people or something.
Are you talking about room 11 on Stack Overflow?
Yeah, that's what I
Yeah,
meant.
yeah. Actually, I've never done any IRC stuff, but I've heard that PHP Women, the PHP Women channel, is a really great one to ask newbie questions. If you're afraid to people will make fun of you, whatever. Because just a heads up, people will make fun of newbie questions. Like they like to laugh at people's non-knowledge or whatever. Just kind of get used to it. Just be like, okay, they're gonna make fun of me, whatever. But just be prepared for it. But there are rooms that you'll find that are actually totally newbie friendly, and you can ask the newbiest questions of all, and people will help you out gladly. Just don't expect them to just hand you code. Like try to do the work yourself. Like try to figure out what the keywords are, and people will help you find that out. I find that room 11 is actually pretty beginner friendly. I mean, there are some people in there that troll a little bit, but I've heard PHP Women on IRC is actually really good for. Even if you're not a woman, it doesn't matter. That whole community is all about embracing everybody, even if you feel marginalized, to make you not feel like you're being marginalized. So it's a great community. The PHP community in general is just fantastic. I think there's a lot of really good people that just try out there to help.
Yeah, and I want to say that when you are asking for help, one thing that I would say is pretty big is to mention what you've done. And because, like Sammy said, I think there's a lot of people that want to talk bad when somebody asks a question. I think sometimes it comes down to people looking for handouts. I think they may have come across so many people that are just asking questions because they didn't take the time to research or even trying to figure out what the problem at hand is. They're just looking for someone else to kind of solve it for them. And so if you can somehow explain some things that you've done in order to try to figure out this problem in that sort of context, I think it'll help with those types of things.
Absolutely. Learning to ask questions, I think, is really important, and you'll get better at it as you go. But just some tips is don't just say, "Hey, it doesn't work. How do I make it work?" Like you got to provide a little bit more a little bit more detail. And in fact, the two details that you really want to think about are the error message you're getting, like specifics, like does it say error on this line, and also if you can narrow it down to like which piece of the code is actually causing the problem. I think it's within these 10 lines, and you can copy and paste those 10 lines or something. But don't just paste 700 lines and be like, it doesn't work. You're not going to get much help that way.
Right. The more specific, the better. Because if Sammy came to me and said, "Hey, this doesn't work," I'd be like, "Okay, what doesn't work?" And then eventually that would lead into, then he would, say, "Okay, this line 30 is giving me not found exception or something," and then we could start talking about the specifics. But it all comes down to the specifics because, I mean, this is technical in nature.
Absolutely. Yeah. So don't get discouraged by getting made fun of as a newbie. It's just going to happen. It's like kind of paying the dues, unfortunately. But it's
not from us.
Yeah, not from us. And once you find that community that doesn't give you heck for being a newbie, just stick with it. And then once you get to that point where you're able to contribute back, and you'll be able to start contributing back actually pretty soon. Once you find out what echo means, somebody's going to ask, "What does echo mean?" And you can answer that question. Even if you don't know much PHP, you can immediately start contributing back to the community and be that nice person who's like, "Yay, yeah, we like newbies." So, and PHP for the most part, we like newbies. So you guys are good here. And we mentioned user groups real quick. I know we have to kind of wrap it up here. I know this has been a really great conversation. We could talk about this forever, but we talked about joining a local user group by going to like meetup.com and like searching for PHP user group in Chicago or wherever you live. There's also an online user group run by Cal Evans and Kathy Evans and Joe Ferguson, some great people. It's called nomadphp.com, and they have basically regular meetups like you would in real person, but they're happening online, and they're not paying me to promote this at all. This is all just because they're awesome, and they're it's a great resource, and their lightning talks that they have before the actual main meetup is free. So it's a cool little resource to kind of get connected with some people online. And another place you can get connected is by going to specific nerd events. There's all kinds of like PHP nerd events out there, like PHP Tech is a good one. I didn't actually write any down, but the one in Florida
PHP
with
World, right?
Sunshine.
PHP World's coming up, yeah, in DC.
Sunshine PHP.
Sunshine PHP, that's a great one. I love that one. And Pacific Northwest PHP, by the way, is coming up in September, and this will be the first time ever I got accepted as a speaker there, so I'm super excited. So I hope to see you guys there at Pacific Northwest PHP, and it should be fun. September 15th through the 17th of this year. So if you want to just jump right into the deep end and just go like, I'm going to a community and going to figure this out, and if you're close to Seattle or you're going to fly out to Seattle, just do it and have fun with us in September, and we'll talk about all kinds of PHP stuff. So as we try to wrap this thing up, do you guys have any, maybe some final encouragement or some common pitfalls that people might run into that you just kind of want to give them like that last little push to be like, you can do it?
Yeah, absolutely. You said the word discouraged, and I think that's huge because we've been talking about a lot of technical things, kind of how to get into programming technically, but I feel like there's also a mental aspect which we could talk about also for a long time, but there's a very huge mental aspect, and that is, whether it's people are giving you a hard time because you asked a new question and you didn't explain it well, to just kind of rub it off and keep going. But also there's the mental aspect of thinking about things as if a programmer would think about things, and in a logical way, because the things that we do, it can't just kind of, you can't just kind of put something. I don't know what a good analogy is, but we deal with things in specifics and not so much like, hey, can you kind of just make that thing appear somewhere over there? Well, no, it has to be somewhere specifically over there. It doesn't just kind of happen, sort of. It's either happening or not happening, kind of thing. So I would say that's a really big mental shift than what a lot of people are used to.
Yeah, one thing I would say too is like you can follow along tutorials, and that's cool, and you can get something working, or you could maybe learn something. But every so often, I think like shut down the tutorial and just like think about writing the code, because I think people tend to feel like they can do a whole lot, but without that tutorial like showing them, they may not remember it. So just kind of keep that in mind as you learn.
Yeah, set a goal. Well, I mean, without a goal, the end is endless, pretty much. Just if you set a goal, say, hey, I want to build a calculator, or hey, I build a to-do app, or something. It gives you an endpoint, because it could just literally go on forever and ever. Then set a new goal once you meet that goal.
That's really good advice. I like that, especially when you're first starting out. I guess you're trying to learn all the keywords and all this stuff that you need to learn, the syntax. And then at one point you start copy and pasting snippets of code online and jumbling them together, and it kind of works. But I like what you said, Andy. If you just shut the internet down, turn off that stuff for a second, just start with a clean slate and just start from the first line and struggle it out. Just try to program that out instead of copy paste. I mean, we all grew up copy pasting. We're PHP programmers. We're notorious for it. But at some point, we got to grow out of copy paste, right?
Right.
But it's not a bad place to be. Like wherever you are in this learning thing, just embrace it where you are and just keep learning. That's just never stop learning, which is the official slogan, I believe, of Laracast, which is the official sponsor for the developer shoutout. Little smooth transition there. Nice. And the developer shoutout is this segment where we recognize a developer in the community for being awesome, because the PHP community is awesome, and there's so many people that have contributed so much to the community and selflessly and thanklessly contribute a lot. And for this episode, like we said, Laracast is sponsoring a $50 Amazon gift card that we can award this specific person here. And if you've never been there, we've already talked about it a little bit, but you can go to laracast.com and you can see all these screencasts by this guy, Jeffrey Way, who shows you how to do PHP the right way, or a good way. I shouldn't say the right way because that makes it sound like, oh, this is the only way. There's many ways. Oh my gosh. Programming is like skinning a cat. That's kind of a bad thing to say, but I love cats. But there's so many different ways you can do programming. There's so many different ways to approach. So don't ever get stuck in the thought that like this is the only way or this is this is the wrong way or whatever. Just keep pushing, and Jeffrey will guide you along the way. He does an amazing job with this website. So thank you, Jeffrey and Laracast, for sponsoring the developer shoutout for so long. This panel that we talked to today, Andy and Nick, I was asking them, so who do you think would be a good person to nominate for the developer shoutout for this episode? Maybe somebody who does a really great job of onboarding new developers to PHP. And they were saying, what about like the people behind the PHP the Right Way, which is a website you could actually go to as a great resource to figure out like once you get more comfortable with PHP, like, okay, so how are other people doing this? Like, are there standards? Like, is there like a best practices I should look at? PHPtherightway.com is a great way to check out. I was like, I don't actually know who's behind PHP the Right Way exactly, so I went to GitHub.com, which, by the way, is another resource you'll love in the future when you learn to program. But I was looking at the top contributor, and I just said, well, why don't we just award the top contributor the developer shoutout, right? So the top contributor on PHP the Right Way on GitHub, when I looked at it, was Code Guy, which is Josh Lockhart. So Josh Lockhart, who's also the author of a very popular framework, a micro framework, the Slim framework, and I'm trying to pull it up right now because I actually didn't have the GitHub repo pulled up, so I'm wanting to make sure that I'm crediting him the right way here. Give me just 1 second. You go to github.com/slim. That's not it. We're going to type in Slim. I should have done this beforehand, but I didn't. Okay, it's slimphp/slim. That's what it is. And so it's github.com/slimphp/slim, and that's Code Guy or Josh Lockhart's micro framework. And we'll get into frameworks later. That's like something that you'll enjoy when you get further along on your coding adventure. So thanks, Josh, for all that you do with not only your contributions to PHP the Right Way, but also for your awesome framework, your micro framework. And thanks again, Laracast, for sponsoring the developer shoutout. I'll reach out to you, Josh, about getting your snail mail address and sending this Amazon gift card to you. Oh, and by the way, I should also thank Andy for contributing to the show notes for episode 49, Event Sourcing in PHP. So, Andy, I usually thank you on when you're not on the roundtable, but you're here, so thanks.
Sweet.
Cool. So let's officially wrap this thing up with some shameless plugs. You guys got anything you want to promote? Andy, you want to start?
I mean, I guess like I put out a package about a month ago, maybe, that allows you to use the artisan. So if you use Laravel, you can use the artisan command to like reset a password for a user or create a new user, which is kind of annoying if you have to do it through Tinker or the database or something like that. So it's just easy to use. It's at github.com/ahuggins/utilities.
Sweet.
Nice.
What about you, Nick? You got anything you want to promote?
Yeah, I'll promote the Chicago PHP User Group.
Woo!
Yeah. So at the end of this month, August 29th, we're having Ed Finkler talk. I hope I pronounced his name right.
Yeah.
Okay. We're having him talk on Stronger Than Fear, Mental Health in the Developer Community. And yeah, that should be great. And then I guess the only other thing is just, if anybody wants to continue this conversation on Twitter or anywhere else, I guess, I'm on Twitter at Nick_Escobedo.
Yes, absolutely. And if you go to phproundtable.com, we'll have a link to both of their Twitter profiles on the website and some show notes, hopefully, if someone contributes to them at github.com/phproundtable/show-notes, which could be a great open source contribution. So thank you, Andy and Nick, for joining us in this conversation. If you want to join us in the upcoming episodes, we got some really cool things planned, including the next one, August 16th at 12 p.m. CDT Central Time. We're talking about what happened to PHP 6. For those of you who are following PHP, realize that we went from PHP 5 to PHP 7. It's like, whoa, what happened to PHP 6? We're going to talk about that on August 16th. Also, August 25th is the Happy Birthday PHP Roundtable. It'll be officially 2 years since the PHP Roundtable started. So I'm not really sure what we're going to do for that episode, but I'm sure it'll be fun. probably bring in some people from Room 11 on Stack Overflow, and a couple of more, 2 other episodes that I'm pretty excited about in September. Not really scheduled out yet, but the first one is why I'm afraid to admit I use PHP, talking about this stigma that exists for PHP programmers in the world today, in the development world. And finally, in late September, we're going to be talking about hourly versus value-based pricing. So starting back on that business conversation of how do we charge our clients, and some strategery, which is an official word, by the way. Not really. But we're going to talk about some strategy that we can use, whether we charge hourly or value-based, and what those are, and like why you should and when you should do those kinds of things. So thanks again for joining us, Andrew and Nick, and we will see you guys in the next episode.
Thank you.
Peace.
Cool.